Chapter 1. The Aliens Challenge. We are about to embark on a study of the most peculiar, baffling creature on this planet, the human being. Because we are human and surrounded by our own kind constantly, we have grown entirely blind to how utterly bizarre we truly are. To correct this profound blindness, we must adopt an entirely new vantage point. We must look at ourselves through eyes that are completely foreign, the uncomprehending eyes of a hypothetical, hyper-intelligent extraterrestrial. Imagine an anthropologist from the distant planet Betelgeuse III arriving on Earth in an intergalactic vessel to study us the way a microbiologist studies the swarming life in a drop of water. This alien is gender-neutral, asexual, asocial, and amoral. It lacks our religions and our music. To this being, the everyday elements of human existence are utterly alien. By borrowing its perspective, we can strip away the comforting veil of familiarity and awaken to the aspects of our own nature that we typically overlook. While no such extraterrestrial has ever actually visited our world, this thought experiment allows us to ask a vital question. What would an outside observer make of our sex differences, our mating habits, our parenting, our morality, our religions, and our languages? Imagine reading a dispatch published in the prestigious journal of a Betelgeusian academy. The report describes Earth as a seemingly unremarkable planet orbiting an average star. For billions of years, it changed at a glacial pace, disrupted only by the occasional asteroid or volcano. But recently, a sudden, frantic acceleration occurred. Forests were eradicated and replaced by uniform fields of geometric crops. Strange, sprawling structures began to multiply across the land like a fungal mold. The planet began emitting a continuous stream of radio waves, and metallic objects were thrown into orbit, acting as sensory organs for this rapidly awakening world. Upon closer investigation, the extraterrestrial observer discovered that the driving force behind this planetary upheaval was a plague of technology-wielding meat creatures. These fragile, bipedal biological machines had somehow discovered how to convert the biosphere's resources into an ever-expanding population of themselves. They enslaved the plants, constructed the sprawling cities, and engineered the orbital eyes. To any civilized Betelgeusian, the behavior of these humans is so extreme and seemingly irrational that some might suspect they were a hoax or a biological practical joke engineered by a rival galactic civilization. To understand these creatures, the alien observer starts at the biological foundation. A human is essentially a vast colony of single-celled organisms arranged into a self-replicating shape. Yet their method of reproduction is shockingly inefficient. Instead of simply cloning themselves, they rely on a bizarre merging of hereditary material between two distinct physical morphs, male and female. Furthermore, these land-dwelling, modified fish spend roughly a third of their fleeting lives entirely unconscious, in a vulnerable, plant-like state of hibernation. But the mysteries deepen when observing their behavior. Natural selection dictates that living things should act to survive and reproduce. Humans, however, constantly defy this ancient imperative. They possess a ravenous appetite for toxic substances and foods that actively shorten their lives. They harbor profound fears of harmless things, like the dark or spiders safely confined outside their dwellings, yet show no natural fear of the genuine lethal threats of their modern environment, like fast-moving vehicles or deadly narcotics. Perhaps most bafflingly, many humans deliberately deploy contraptions to block their own fertility, actively thwarting the very purpose of their biological design. When examining the two morphs, the male and the female, the observer notes distinct behavioral and physical differences. The larger males are more aggressive and prone to life-threatening risks, while the smaller females are choosier about their sexual partners and heavily involved in rearing the young. While these patterns echo those found in other mammals, the human version is strangely muted. In most species, the males alone compete, and the females alone care for the offspring. But among these upright apes, both sexes compete for long-term mates, both display choosiness, and both frequently share the burden of raising their exceptionally helpless and terrifying young. The mating rituals of these creatures are equally confounding. They evaluate potential partners by scrutinizing the subtle aesthetic geometry of their facial features. To initiate a pair bond, the male might offer the female the severed reproductive organs of local vegetation, or the two might ingest fermented plant juices until their cognitive functions are impaired. This can trigger a temporary, two-person psychological madness they call love, a condition that defies all rational scrutiny and can lead to devastating misery or even violence if the bond is broken. Why natural selection would favor such an irrational and potentially debilitating syndrome remains a profound mystery. And while their dedication to their immediate offspring and close relatives aligns with evolutionary logic, their capacity to sacrifice themselves for complete strangers or even other species defies every known rule of biological self-interest. Beyond their physical oddities, human behavior is deeply infested with seemingly pointless activities. They spend enormous fractions of their waking lives expelling air through their facial cavities, making patterned noises to transmit ideas that have nothing to do with survival. They gather in massive groups to perform elaborate, costly rituals aimed at telepathically communicating with invisible, undetectable entities they call gods. Furthermore, they deliberately induce trance-like states by staring at artificial colored splodges, convulsing their bodies to rhythmic sounds, or sitting motionless while watching flickering screens that display events that never actually happened. If these creatures redirected the immense energy squandered on chatter, religious rituals, and fictional entertainment toward the sheer production of offspring, their biological success would be vastly greater. Yet, despite their profound intellectual limitations, their leaky memories, and their inability to perform advanced mathematics without external prostheses, these same hapless apes have somehow accumulated an intricate, staggering body of knowledge. They have managed to peer back into the very origins of the universe and decipher the hidden laws of reality. How could such a flawed, fragile creature come to understand the vast cosmos of which it is but a fleeting speck? The aliens' profound confusion mirrors our own historical struggles to comprehend human nature. Throughout time, humanity has generated an endless parade of conflicting philosophies to explain itself, from the belief that we are fallen angels, to the notion that we are immaterial minds trapped in mechanistic bodies, to the view that we are entirely blank slates shaped only by culture. Logic dictates that these contradictory ideas cannot all be true, yet we now find ourselves at a unique moment in history. For the first time, we have the conceptual tools to sketch an accurate explanation of human behavior and culture. We can answer the aliens' challenge by drawing on two powerful theoretical frameworks: evolutionary psychology and cultural evolutionary theory. Evolutionary psychology begins with the undeniable premise that humans are animals, and like all animals, our bodies and our minds are the products of natural selection. Our basic emotions, our fears, our sexual desires, and our parental devotions are adaptations crafted to solve the recurrent challenges of our ancestral past. But the evolutionary approach extends far beyond basic drives, reaching into the complex realms of human mating, jealousy, and kin favoritism. These phenomena are not mere artifacts of socialization. They are woven into the very fabric of our biology, designed by a blind process with one ultimate goal: to pass genes on to the next generation. We are, at our core, biological mechanisms engineered for genetic propagation. Yet, biological evolution alone cannot fully explain the human animal. It is enough for the goats and the jellyfish, but not for us. Our true defining feature is our capacity for culture. Once we developed the ability to stockpile knowledge and pass it across generations, a second evolutionary process was ignited. Ideas, beliefs, and practices, what we might call memes, began to evolve in their own right, subject to their own blind forces of selection. The ideas that survive in our culture are not always those that benefit us. Sometimes they survive simply because they are highly infectious. Thus, to fully understand ourselves, we must recognize that we are a dual-natured entity. We are the meeting point of two evolutionary forces. We are hybrids, driven by the sometimes conflicting agendas of our genes and our socially transmitted ideas. To solve the riddle of the ape that understood the universe, we must explore both of these evolutionary tapestries. Chapter 2. Darwin comes to mind. We are super freaks. When we step back and view the human animal objectively, we must confront the undeniable reality that we are an extreme outlier in the grand tapestry of terrestrial life. We are a bizarre, hyper-social, hyper-intelligent anomaly. We build skyscrapers, split atoms, compose symphonies, and sequence our own genetic code. The cognitive and cultural chasm between us and our closest living relatives is staggering. Yet, to understand this freakish nature, to comprehend how a terrestrial primate managed to leap so far from the bounds of ordinary animal existence, we cannot rely on myth or mysticism. We must turn to the singular, foundational mechanism that shapes all biological reality, a mechanism that provides the only logical origin story for our extraordinary existence. This brings us to the greatest idea anyone ever had: natural selection. Before Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, the sheer complexity of life, the perfect aerodynamic curve of a bird's wing, the astonishing optical engineering of an eye, seemed to demand the existence of a conscious, deliberate designer. How else could such intricate functionality arise? Natural selection provided a revolutionary, counterintuitive answer. Blind, mindless processes can generate staggering complexity over deep time. It requires only 3 basic ingredients: variation, heredity, and differential reproduction. Organisms vary in their traits, they pass these traits to their offspring, and organisms with traits better suited to their environment survive longer and leave more offspring. Over millions of generations, this relentless, unthinking sieve of nature sculpts organisms to fit their ecological niches with breathtaking precision. It is an algorithm that builds design without a designer, purpose without a mind. But if natural selection is the sculptor, what is the purpose of the sculpture? What are people for? In the strictest biological sense, we are not engineered to be happy, self-actualized, or even morally good. The merciless logic of evolution dictates that we, like all living things, are essentially survival and reproduction mechanisms. We are designed to successfully navigate our environment just long enough to pass the biological instructions that built us into the next generation. Every innate desire, every reflexive fear, every profound emotional bond exists because, at some point in our ancestral past, it facilitated survival and reproductive success. However, mere survival is not enough. An organism that lives a long, healthy life but fails to reproduce is an evolutionary failure. Its traits are extinguished. This realization led Darwin to a secondary, equally profound concept: his sexy idea of sexual selection. He noticed that many traits in nature actually hinder survival. The peacock's massive, colorful tail makes it slow and conspicuous to predators, while the heavy antlers of a stag require massive caloric investment. These traits evolve not because they aid survival, but because they aid in securing a mate. Sexual selection is the evolutionary arms race driven by female choice and male competition. It is a powerful, creative force that has profoundly shaped not only the physical ornamentation of animals, but also the complex, hidden architectures of the human mind. Yet a glaring paradox remained in the evolutionary story: the existence of altruism. If nature is a ruthless, competitive struggle for reproductive dominance, why do individuals so frequently sacrifice their own safety and resources for others? Why do bees sting and die to protect the hive? Why do humans risk their lives for their children? The resolution to this paradox came in the form of the inclusive fitness revolution. Evolution, it turns out, does not merely favor the survival of the individual, it favors the survival of the genetic information itself. Because we share copies of our genes with our relatives, half with our children and siblings, a quarter with our nieces and nephews, helping them survive and reproduce is a mathematical equivalent to reproducing ourselves. Altruism toward kin is not a refutation of evolutionary theory, it is one of its most elegant predictions. This paradigm shift forces us to adopt a radical new perspective, the gene's eye view. We are accustomed to thinking of ourselves as the protagonists of our own lives, the ultimate beneficiaries of our actions. But from a biological standpoint, we are merely temporary vehicles. We are lumbering, mortal robots constructed by immortal replicators, our genes. The genes are the true units of selection, riding inside us, driving our behaviors, and seeking only to copy themselves into the next generation before our temporary bodies perish and decay. We are the mortal husks. They are the immortal passengers. For decades, many thinkers resisted this harsh reality by clinging to the idea of group selection, asking whether traits might evolve purely for the good of the group or the species. It is a comforting thought, suggesting an innate, harmonious drive toward collective well-being. Unfortunately, the mathematics of biology rarely support it. In almost all circumstances, a group of pure altruists is highly vulnerable to selfish freeloaders. A single selfish mutant within an altruistic group will consume resources without giving back, thereby reproducing faster than the altruists. Over generations, the selfish genes will inevitably outcompete the altruistic ones, tearing the group apart from the inside. Evolution is ultimately driven by what benefits the replicator, not the collective. If we accept that evolution shapes our bodies, we must take the final logical step. Evolution also shapes our minds. The brain is not an ethereal spiritual entity. It is a physical organ that consumes massive amounts of energy, subject to the exact same evolutionary pressures as the liver or the lungs. The blank slate theory, the idea that the human mind is born entirely empty, waiting to be inscribed solely by culture and experience, is biologically impossible. Instead, evolutionary psychology reveals that our minds are densely populated with evolved mechanisms, specific psychological adaptations designed to solve the distinct recurring problems our hunter-gatherer ancestors faced on the African savanna. Applying this logic requires leaving the comfort zone. It means stripping away the romanticized illusions we hold about human nature. It forces us to confront the reality that our deepest emotions, our jealousies, our tribal loyalties, our aggressive impulses, and even our capacity for profound love are not pure, unadulterated spiritual forces, but pragmatic, biological tools forged in the crucible of ancestral survival. Nowhere is this more evident than in the concept of the mating mind. Just as sexual selection sculpted the peacock's tail, it heavily influenced human cognition. Our capacity for complex language, our appreciation for art, our sense of humor, and our staggering creativity are not merely byproducts of having a large brain. They are, in many respects, psychological ornaments. They evolved as elaborate cognitive displays to signal genetic quality, intelligence, and fitness to potential mates. Our highest cultural achievements are deeply intertwined with our most base biological imperatives. Understanding this evolutionary history reveals a profound tragedy. We are exiles from Eden. The human psychological architecture was painstakingly calibrated over millions of years for a specific environment, small nomadic bands foraging on the Pleistocene savanna. We are an ancient species suddenly thrust into an alien modern world of our own making. This profound evolutionary mismatch explains much of our contemporary suffering. We are essentially a fish out of water. We inhabit vast, anonymous concrete cities surrounded by millions of strangers. Yet we are wired to thrive in intimate groups of 150 people. We are bombarded by endless streams of refined sugars and fats, resources that were life-savingly rare in the ancestral environment, and our ancient cravings drive us toward modern epidemics of obesity and disease. Our stress responses, designed to trigger brief, life-saving bursts of energy to flee from a predator, are constantly, chronically activated by traffic jams, emails, and social media, slowly deteriorating our physical and mental health. Finally, to truly understand the human mind, we must recognize that not every thought or behavior is a perfectly tuned adaptation. The evolutionary process is constrained by history and physics. It is a tinkerer, not a master engineer. This results in the creation of spandrels, architectural byproducts of evolution. Just as the heat of a light bulb is an unintended byproduct of its design to produce light, many aspects of our psychology may be complex, magnificent byproducts of a large, adaptive brain. Dreams, religion, and complex philosophical thought may not have been directly selected for their survival value. Rather, they are the profound, unintended consequences of throwing a spandrel in the works of a hyper-intelligent, socially complex primate trying to make sense of the universe. Chapter 3. The XY Animal. The division of humanity into two distinct biological categories is the most fundamental fracture line in our species. Across the globe, transcending every cultural boundary, linguistic barrier, and historical epoch, the human experience is deeply bifurcated by the realities of biological sex. To understand the human animal, one must confront the profound implications of being either an XX or an XY organism. This is not merely a matter of differing anatomical plumbing. It is a divergence in evolutionary history, a split in the ancestral pressures that forged our bodies and, crucially, our minds. An academic culture war. To assert that biological sex profoundly shapes human psychology is to step directly into the crossfire of a ferocious intellectual conflict. For decades, the dominant narrative within the social sciences has fiercely resisted the intrusion of biology into the realm of human behavior. This resistance is rooted in a deeply held paradigm that views the human mind at birth as an immaculate, unwritten tablet, a blank slate. According to this doctrine, any psychological or behavioral divergence between men and women is entirely the artificial product of socialization. It is the result of pink and blue blankets, culturally imposed gender roles, and the systemic conditioning of a patriarchal society. From this vantage point, to suggest that our evolutionary past has hardwired different reproductive strategies into the male and female brain is seen as not just scientifically incorrect, but morally dangerous, a justification for historical inequalities. The evolutionary perspective, however, demands a radical departure from this comforting illusion. It posits that the human brain, like the heart or the lungs, is an organ sculpted by the blind, pragmatic forces of natural selection. It is entirely biologically implausible that millions of years of distinct evolutionary pressures, which painstakingly crafted the physical differences between the sexes, somehow magically bypassed the central nervous system. The psychological mechanisms governing desire, aggression, risk-taking, and parental attachment were forged in the unforgiving crucible of the ancestral environment. Denying this biological inheritance does not erase it. It merely leaves us blind to the true architecture of our own nature, trapped in an endless ideological debate that ignores the foundational blueprints of human life. The evolution of sex differences. To decipher why these differences exist, one must look past the superficial and examine the brutal economic logic of reproduction. The story of sex differences begins at a microscopic level with a profound biological asymmetry. The fundamental difference between the female egg and the male sperm. An egg is a massive, nutrient-rich, incredibly expensive biological investment. A sperm is microscopic, stripped down to bare genetic material and produced by the millions at virtually no physiological cost. This initial inequality in investment sets the stage for everything that follows. When one sex invests vastly more time, energy, and physical resources into the creation and gestation of offspring, that sex becomes the limiting factor in reproduction. In mammals, the female bears the immense physiological burdens of internal gestation and prolonged lactation. Because her reproductive capacity is strictly limited, her evolutionary imperative is to protect that heavy investment. She must be uncompromisingly selective, evaluating potential mates for genetic quality and the capacity to provide resources. Conversely, the sex that invests less, typically the male, faces a completely different evolutionary mathematical equation. His reproductive success is not limited by his own physiological capacity to bear children, but by his ability to access the heavily investing sex. This asymmetry unleashes a fierce competition. The lesser investing sex must fight, display, and constantly strive to win the reproductive lottery, leading to the evolution of larger physical size, biological weaponry, and psychological algorithms tuned for relentless competition. Are people peacocks or penguins? When observing the vast theater of the animal kingdom, distinct mating patterns emerge. At one extreme is the peacock. This bird represents a highly polygynous mating system characterized by extreme physical dimorphism. The male is heavily ornamented and invests nothing in the offspring beyond his genetic material. His entire biological budget is spent on competing for multiple mates. At the other extreme is the penguin. Penguins are largely monogamous, deeply pair-bonded, and show virtually no physical differences between the sexes. Both mother and father are strictly required to invest immense effort to keep a single chick alive in the freezing Antarctic. Where does the human animal fall on this spectrum? We are a perplexing hybrid. We are not purely monogamous penguins, nor are we highly polygynous peacocks. We inhabit a messy, complex middle ground. The physical evidence written into our bodies reveals a history of mild polygyny and male competition. Human males are, on average, taller, heavier, and possess significantly more upper body strength than females. They mature later, die younger, and are vastly more prone to physical violence and risk-taking, all classic biological signatures of a species where males historically competed for multiple mates. Yet, unlike the peacock, human males display a profound, intense capacity for paternal investment. The helplessness of the human infant, with its massive, slowly developing brain, necessitated an evolutionary shift. Fathers who stayed, protected and provisioned gave their offspring a massive survival advantage. Thus, humanity evolved the psychological machinery for deep, long-term pair bonding and biparental care, layered awkwardly over an ancient foundation of competitive polygyny. Keeping it casual, this dual nature becomes starkly apparent when examining the psychological appetite for short-term, uncommitted sexual encounters. If one strips away the veneer of cultural propriety and examines the raw underlying desires of the human animal, a massive divide opens between the sexes. While both men and women are fully capable of pursuing short-term liaisons, the underlying motivational architectures are fundamentally different. The male psychological mechanism is uniquely calibrated to desire sheer sexual variety. This is not a cultural artifact, but a deeply ingrained algorithm designed to minimize missed reproductive opportunities. The threshold for sexual attraction to a novel partner is significantly lower in males, and the willingness to engage in intimacy after a microscopic duration of acquaintance is dramatically higher. The pursuit of casual encounters, the consumption of visual sexual stimuli, and the fantasy of multiple partners are overwhelmingly driven by the male of the species. While females certainly engage in and enjoy short-term mating, it is rarely driven by the same indiscriminate appetite for numerical variety. Female psychology remains tethered to a more complex calculus of partner quality, context, and potential consequence. Explaining the casual sex gap. The existence of this profound psychological gap is not an arbitrary mystery. It is the direct consequence of the ancestral costs associated with reproduction. To understand the casual sex gap, one must teleport back to the Pleistocene epoch, long before the advent of modern medicine, safe environments, and reliable contraception. In that harsh ancestral environment, a single, fleeting sexual encounter carried drastically different consequences for a man and a woman. For an ancestral female, an injudicious moment of intimacy could trigger a catastrophic biological tax. It meant 9 months of physically demanding and highly dangerous gestation, followed by the agonizing risks of childbirth. If she survived, she faced years of relentless caloric drainage through lactation, carrying a helpless, crying infant across the savannah, deeply vulnerable to predators and starvation. A poor mate choice, selecting a partner with poor genetics or one who would abandon her, was a direct threat to her survival and the survival of her genetic lineage. Therefore, female psychology evolved an intense, protective scrutiny, a subconscious alarm system that demanded a rigorous evaluation of a partner before granting sexual access. For an ancestral male, the biological cost of that exact same encounter was essentially zero. He risked a few minutes of time and a negligible amount of cellular material. If the encounter resulted in offspring, it was a pure genetic victory with no obligatory physical cost. Consequently, male psychology evolved to be fiercely opportunistic, wired to seize low-investment reproductive chances with minimal discrimination. Looking good. The criteria by which these ancient psychological algorithms evaluate potential mates are what we experience as the perception of beauty. Physical attractiveness is not a trivial, socially constructed illusion. It is an ancient, unconscious fitness assessment. We do not find certain features beautiful by accident. We find them beautiful because, in the deep ancestral past, those features were highly reliable indicators of health, fertility, and reproductive viability. Because male reproductive success has historically been constrained by access to fertile females, male psychology evolved to prioritize visual cues that broadcast youth and reproductive health. Features such as clear skin, facial symmetry, lustrous hair, and a specific waist-to-hip ratio are not arbitrary magazine standards. They are deeply ingrained biological signals of optimal fertility and an uncompromised immune system. A male brain is wired to experience these cues as intensely rewarding. Female psychology, while also deeply attuned to the physical health and symmetry of a potential mate, evolved to solve a more complex equation. Because human infants require immense long-term support, female algorithms simultaneously assess a mate's capacity and willingness to extract resources from the environment and offer protection. Thus, alongside physical form, cues of social status, ambition, confidence, and dominance become vital vectors of attractiveness. The pursuit of a mate is the collision of these ancient, hardwired assessments shaping the endless, complex dance of human courtship. Chapter 4. The Dating, Mating, Baby-Making Animal. The human animal is an evolutionary paradox, a creature caught in a profound biological tension between the restless, ancient drives of a polygynous primate and the intense, demanding requirements of a highly dependent offspring. To look at our closest evolutionary cousins, the chimpanzees, is to see a world devoid of the enduring pair bond. In their societies, mating is promiscuous, and the burden of raising the young falls entirely upon the mother. Yet, at some crucial juncture in our ancestral past, the human lineage took a radical departure. We began to form deep, enduring attachments between males and females. We invented the psychological machinery for what we now call love, and the cultural institution we recognize as marriage. This was not a moral awakening, but a brutal biological necessity. The evolutionary arms race that produced our massive, neurologically dense brains resulted in infants that were born dangerously premature and utterly helpless. A female navigating the perilous ancestral savanna could not easily provision herself and a highly demanding infant alone. The survival of the genetic line required a dramatic behavioral shift, the recruitment of the male. Thus, the human male evolved a capacity for immense paternal investment, transforming us into a uniquely cooperative breeding species. This shift toward long-term pair bonding transformed the human mating arena into a complex, high-stakes biological marketplace. Because both sexes are required to invest heavily in the successful rearing of an infant, both sexes evolved to be intensely discerning when selecting a long-term partner. We do not choose our mates at random. Instead, we engage in a ruthless, largely unconscious process of assortative mating, like seeks out like. We continuously evaluate our own mate value, a composite score of our physical health, social status, intelligence, and resources, and we seek to strike a bargain with a partner of roughly equivalent value. The courtship rituals of the human animal are extended periods of mutual assessment, designed to test compatibility, loyalty, and the capacity to weather the immense stresses of raising vulnerable offspring. It is an intricate negotiation where physical symmetry must be weighed against emotional stability, and where the promise of resources is balanced against the likelihood of fidelity. The profound vulnerability inherent in this massive biological investment birthed one of the most agonizing and destructive emotions in the human repertoire: jealousy. Far from being a mere cultural artifact or a symptom of psychological insecurity, jealousy is a highly calibrated evolutionary alarm system. It is the dark guardian of the pair bond, designed to protect an individual's reproductive assets from catastrophic loss. Because the evolutionary costs of betrayal are so severe, the human mind is wired to be exquisitely sensitive to the slightest cues of infidelity. However, because the ancestral threats faced by males and females were fundamentally different, the architecture of their jealousy diverges in deeply significant ways. For the ancestral male, the primary reproductive threat was the terrifying specter of paternity uncertainty. Unlike the female, who possesses absolute, irrefutable biological proof that the child she bears carries her genes, the male in the ancestral environment had no such guarantee. The evolutionary penalty for a male who failed to guard his mate was absolute ruin. He risked dedicating a lifetime of scarce, hard-won resources, protection, and labor to the genetic propagation of a rival. Consequently, male psychology evolved a ferocious, visceral sensitivity to sexual infidelity. The mere thought of a partner engaging in sexual contact with another male triggers an intense, often explosive emotional response, a biological failsafe designed to prevent the ultimate evolutionary disaster of raising another man's child. This ancient anxiety has echoed through the ages, shaping human history through the oppressive sequestering of women, the cultural obsession with female chastity, and the violent enforcement of patriarchal control. For the ancestral female, the evolutionary calculus of betrayal was vastly different. Her certainty of maternity was absolute, so the threat of a rival's genetic infiltration into her womb was non-existent. Instead, her greatest peril lay in the diversion of her partner's vital resources. In the unforgiving environment of our evolutionary past, the survival of her highly dependent offspring relied completely on the continued protection, food, and social status provided by her mate. If her partner were to form a deep emotional attachment to another female, he might redirect his time, his hunting yields, and his defensive capabilities to that rival's children. Therefore, female psychology evolved to be agonizingly sensitive to emotional infidelity, the prospect of a mate falling in love with someone else, of shifting his fundamental loyalties, triggers a profound psychological agony designed to alert the female to an impending withdrawal of life-saving resources. While both sexes experience both forms of jealousy, the evolutionary fulcrum rests on different ancestral fears, the male dread of genetic deception and the female terror of resource abandonment. The ultimate terminus of this complex mating machinery is, of course, the baby-making. The physiological and psychological devotion a human parent directs toward their offspring is staggering. This profound, self-sacrificing love is the ultimate triumph of inclusive fitness. It is the mechanism by which selfish genes ensure their own immortality by programming the temporary vehicle, the parent, to prioritize the survival of the new genetic copy over their own comfort, and sometimes even their own life. The relentless exhaustion of child-rearing, the overwhelming anxiety for an infant's safety, and the intense joy of their milestones are not mere sentiments. They are highly evolved biological imperatives, driving the parent to successfully ferry their genetic cargo into the next generation. Yet, this intense, biologically driven devotion casts a dark and tragic shadow over those relationships where the genetic tether is absent. The brutal logic of evolutionary theory becomes starkly apparent when examining the dynamics of step-parenting. The psychological mechanisms that generate spontaneous, unconditional parental love were forged in environments where the children in a household were almost exclusively biological kin. When modern societal structures place adults into parental roles with children who do not share their genetic material, these ancient mechanisms frequently fail to engage with the same protective intensity. This results in the phenomenon known as the Cinderella effect. Statistical realities across diverse cultures reveal that stepchildren face significantly higher risks of neglect, emotional abuse, and fatal violence compared to children living with their biological parents. This is not to suggest that step-parents are inherently malicious, but rather that the profound, irrational, biological shield of parental love is an evolutionary adaptation that is notoriously difficult to trigger in the absence of genetic kinship. The human animal is capable of great compassion, and adopting non-biological children can be a triumph of our cultural morality over our base instincts, but the underlying friction remains a testament to our Darwinian origins. Chapter 5. The Altruistic Animal. To look at the natural world through a strictly Darwinian lens is to witness a theater of relentless, uncompromising self-interest. The fundamental engine of evolution, natural selection, is a merciless accountant, tallying only reproductive success. In such a fiercely competitive arena, where every organism is essentially a survival machine, programmed to propagate its own genetic code, any trait that diminishes an individual's own fitness to enhance the fitness of a rival should be ruthlessly eradicated. The logic is inescapable. Nice guys, in the evolutionary sense, should finish last, their genes swiftly purged from the pool. Yet amidst this theater of genetic selfishness, the human animal presents a staggering anomaly. We are profoundly, inherently social, and our daily lives are woven with threads of cooperation, generosity, and self-sacrifice. We share our food, we shelter the vulnerable, we risk our own safety to rescue strangers, and we donate blood to people we will never meet. This profound capacity for goodness presents one of the most formidable philosophical and biological puzzles. How could a blind, selfish process forge the altruistic animal? The resolution to this paradox begins with a radical shift in perspective, moving away from the individual organism and zooming in on the microscopic architects of life, the genes themselves. When we adopt the gene's eye view, the mystery of biological altruism begins to dissolve into a profound, mathematical elegance. The most ancient and powerful form of human generosity is rooted in kin selection. Because we share a precise percentage of our genetic code with our relatives, half with our children and siblings, a quarter with our grandchildren and nieces, an eighth with our first cousins. A gene that programs an organism to help a relative is, indirectly, helping copies of itself. This is the biological calculus of nepotism. We do not consciously calculate genetic overlap before pulling a sibling from a burning building, but evolution has equipped us with deep, emotional heuristics that do the math for us. We feel a spontaneous, powerful surge of love and protective instinct toward those who share our blood. This kin-directed altruism is not a violation of evolutionary selfishness. It is its most sophisticated manifestation. The genes themselves are entirely selfish, but they achieve their selfish ends by building organisms capable of profound, unselfish devotion to their families. However, human cooperation extends far beyond the boundaries of the family tree. We frequently engage in acts of immense generosity with individuals who share none of our recent genetic heritage. To bridge this gap, evolution devised a second, equally brilliant mechanism: reciprocal altruism. In the perilous environment of the ancestral savanna, an individual's fortunes could fluctuate wildly. A hunter might secure a massive perishable surplus of meat one day, only to face starvation the next. The solution was to store that surplus not in a physical cache, but in the bellies of non-relatives, creating a web of social debt. The unspoken biological contract was simple. I will incur a cost to help you today, with the implicit expectation that you will help me when our circumstances are reversed. This system of reciprocal exchange transformed the human tribe into a vast, interconnected insurance network, dramatically increasing the survival odds of everyone participating. But reciprocal altruism is inherently fragile. It is constantly threatened by the existence of freeloaders, individuals perfectly willing to accept the benefits of others' generosity without ever paying the cost of reciprocating. If cheaters are allowed to prosper, the entire cooperative enterprise collapses. To guard against this, the human mind evolved a highly sophisticated suite of moral emotions, essentially an internal accounting department designed to monitor social ledgers. We developed an exquisite sensitivity to fairness and a visceral, searing anger toward those who cheat or exploit the system. This righteous indignation is an evolutionary weapon, driving us to punish freeloaders even at a cost to ourselves, thereby stabilizing the cooperative network. Conversely, when we receive help, we experience the profound emotion of gratitude, a psychological prompt ensuring we remember our benefactors and feel compelled to return the favor. And when we fail to reciprocate, or when we harm our allies, we are tormented by the agonizing pangs of guilt, an internal alarm system warning us that we are damaging crucial social alliances and risking evolutionary exile. Our capacity for altruism is further amplified by the immense pressure of reputation. In the small, transparent, and highly interdependent hunter-gatherer bands of our ancestors, privacy was non-existent. Every action, every act of sharing, and every selfish transgression was witnessed, remembered, and gossiped about. An individual's reputation was their most valuable currency. A reputation for unyielding generosity and fierce loyalty guaranteed an influx of allies, mates, and reciprocal support in times of crisis. A reputation for stinginess or deceit resulted in social ostracization, which in the Pleistocene epoch was essentially a death sentence. Consequently, the human mind became intensely preoccupied with how it is perceived by the tribe. We evolved a profound desire to be seen as good, moral, and cooperative. This pressure for indirect reciprocity, where we help someone not because they will directly help us but because others are watching, turned social behavior into a high-stakes performance, accelerating the evolution of ever more elaborate displays of altruism and civic virtue. Yet, even kin selection, direct reciprocity, and reputation management cannot fully explain the most magnificent extremes of human goodness. They do not explain why we anonymously donate vast sums of wealth to impoverished communities on the other side of the planet, or why we dive into freezing rivers to save drowning strangers, knowing no one is watching and no reward will follow. To understand these ultimate acts of grace, we must recognize that we are creatures living profoundly out of context. The psychological algorithms that govern our moral emotions were painstakingly calibrated in a world where almost every human we encountered was either a close relative or a lifelong member of our reciprocal network. In that ancient world, a generalized disposition toward kindness was a safe and highly adaptive bet. Today, we have carried these ancient Pleistocene algorithms into a sprawling, globalized world of billions of anonymous strangers. When we see a heartbreaking image of a starving child on a different continent, our evolutionary programming misfires. The ancient savannah brain does not instinctively grasp the concept of an unrelated stranger separated by thousands of miles. It simply registers the distress of a vulnerable human being and triggers the same powerful surge of empathy and protective urgency that it once reserved for a niece or a neighbor. Our highest moral achievements, our expansive charities, our universal declarations of human rights, our anonymous sacrifices are, in a strictly biological sense, evolutionary mistakes. They are glorious misapplications of ancient pragmatic instincts. But it is precisely in these biological errors that the human animal transcends its own programming, proving that while we may be built by blind, selfish processes, the creature that emerged from that crucible is capable of genuine, astonishing nobility. Chapter 6. The Cultural Animal. To view humanity exclusively through the lens of biological evolution is to see only half the picture. The meticulous accounting of genetic self-interest, the ancient algorithms of mating, and the primal dictates of inclusive fitness are foundational, yet they fail to capture the full, staggering scope of the human phenomenon. If natural selection acting upon genes were the sole author of our nature, we would be nothing more than exceedingly clever chimpanzees navigating the world with sophisticated instincts but locked within the rigid confines of our biology. We would not build orbital telescopes, compose symphonies, or debate the origins of our own existence. To answer the challenge of the extraterrestrial observer, to explain the explosive, runaway complexity of human society, we must recognize that our species crossed a profound and unprecedented threshold. We ignited a second evolutionary process. We became the hosts for a new kind of replicator. This secondary evolutionary engine is driven by culture, but not culture in the traditional static sense of customs and artifacts. It is a dynamic Darwinian process operating entirely in the realm of information. Just as the gene is the fundamental unit of biological replication, the human mind became the crucible for a new replicator, the meme. A meme is any unit of cultural information, a melody, a recipe, a religious doctrine, a fashion trend, or a scientific concept that can be copied from one mind to another through imitation and language. The moment early humans developed the cognitive architecture to accurately transmit ideas across individuals and generations, the rules of the game fundamentally changed. The world was no longer shaped exclusively by the slow, agonizingly gradual mutations of DNA. It was suddenly subjected to the blindingly fast, fiercely competitive evolution of ideas. Mimetic evolution operates on the exact same underlying logic as biological evolution: variation, heredity, and differential reproduction. Memes mutate as they are passed along, slightly altered by misunderstandings, deliberate improvements, or the blending of different concepts. These variations are inherited when a new host adopts the idea. Crucially, memes are locked in a ruthless competition for the most precious and limited resource in the cultural universe: human attention and memory. In this mimetic arena, ideas do not survive because they are necessarily true, morally good, or even beneficial to their human hosts. They survive simply because they are highly infectious. A compelling urban legend, a catchy advertising jingle, or a terrifying superstition will replicate rapidly and saturate a population, easily outcompeting a complex, nuanced truth that is harder to remember or less emotionally resonant. The cultural landscape we inhabit is not a rationally designed structure. It is an ecosystem populated by the most successful, battle-tested informational viruses. This realization forces a radical realignment of our understanding of human behavior. We are not merely gene machines. We are also meme machines. And crucially, the interests of these two replicators are frequently in direct, violent conflict. Biological evolution demands that we prioritize survival and reproduction. Mimetic evolution, however, cares nothing for our biological fitness. It seeks only its own propagation. This divergence explains the myriad ways in which human culture actively subverts our biological imperatives. The profound evolutionary mystery of celibate priesthoods or ascetic religious orders, for example, is inexplicable from a purely genetic standpoint. Biologically, voluntarily removing oneself from the gene pool is a catastrophic failure. but from a mimetic perspective, it is a brilliant strategy. A religious doctrine that demands celibacy ensures that its most devoted hosts redirect the immense time, energy, and resources normally consumed by child-rearing into the aggressive spreading of the faith. The genes of the celibate monk perish, but the religious memes thrive and multiply, utilizing the human host as a disposable vehicle for their own transmission. Similarly, the willingness of individuals to sacrifice their lives for an abstract cause, a nation-state, or a political ideology is a triumph of the meme over the gene. The biological organism is destroyed, but the cultural concept is sanctified and spreads with renewed vigor among the survivors. Our minds are the battleground where these two ancient blind forces collide. We are constantly navigating the friction between the deep, primal whispers of our evolutionary past and the loud, demanding commands of the cultural software uploaded into our brains. Yet, this dual inheritance is also the source of our unparalleled power. While biological evolution is confined to the agonizingly slow pace of generations, cultural evolution can pivot and adapt in a single afternoon. When an environmental challenge arises, we do not need to wait for a fortuitous genetic mutation to provide thicker fur or sharper claws. We simply invent coats and spears, transmitting the solution instantly across the tribe. This capacity for cumulative culture, the ability to stockpile knowledge, refine it, and pass it on, means that no single human being needs to be a genius. We stand upon a towering, invisible mountain of accumulated ancestral intelligence. A modern smartphone is not the product of a single brilliant mind. It is the culmination of tens of thousands of years of tiny, incremental mimetic improvements, from the discovery of controlled fire to the mastering of quantum mechanics, stored and transmitted through the cultural ether. Furthermore, these two evolutionary processes do not merely operate in parallel. They become deeply entwined in a phenomenon known as gene-culture co-evolution. Culture does not just sit lightly atop our biology. It violently reshapes the physical environment, which in turn alters the selective pressures acting upon our DNA. The cultural invention of cooking fire, for instance, allowed our ancestors to extract vastly more calories from their food. Over thousands of years, this cultural practice removed the evolutionary necessity for massive jaws and extensive digestive tracts. As our guts shrank, the surplus metabolic energy was redirected to fuel the expansion of our increasingly massive brains. The meme of cooking literally reshaped the anatomy of the human skull. Similarly, the cultural practice of dairy farming created a new environment where a rare genetic mutation, the ability to digest lactose into adulthood, suddenly conferred a massive survival advantage. The culture of agriculture drove the biological evolution of lactase persistence. Our genes built the minds capable of culture, but our culture then turned around and began hacking our genes. In the final analysis, to understand the ape that understood the universe, we must embrace this magnificent duality. We are a hybrid species, the only creature on Earth whose existence is dictated by two overlapping, sometimes cooperating, sometimes warring evolutionary paradigms. We are anchored to the Earth by the ancient heavy chains of our biological history, driven by the same appetites, fears, and mating strategies that propelled our ancestors across the Pleistocene savanna. Yet, we are simultaneously elevated by the light, invisible architecture of our cumulative culture. It is this unique, volatile synthesis of selfish genes and infectious memes that transformed a fragile, shivering biped into a planetary force. We are the improbable terminus of billions of years of blind, algorithmic processes, a fleeting biological vessel that somehow, against all odds, evolved the capacity to look back at the cosmos, to decipher the rules of its own creation, and to comprehend the vast, astonishing universe from which it emerged.